The warriors history remembers as fearless weren't fearless at all. They had simply finished grieving before the fight began. That single shift in mental architecture produced a level of performance that modern psychology is only now beginning to explain. And it runs completely counter to everything the success industry has been selling you. Why the most dangerous competitor in the room has already lost everything. There is an assumption so deeply embedded in modern performance culture that almost no one questions it anymore. The assumption is this: the best performers win because they protect themselves from failure. They visualize success. They reinforce positive outcomes. They build mental barriers between themselves and the possibility of losing. They treat the fear of failure as a problem to be managed, suppressed, or outrun. This assumption is not just incomplete. It is structurally backwards. When you trace the behavioral patterns of the highest performers across radically different domains, elite military units, top-tier surgeons, championship-level negotiators, and the athletes who perform best specifically in the moments when the stakes are highest, you find something that contradicts the entire architecture of mainstream success culture. The common variable among them is not the absence of fear. It is the prior acceptance of the worst possible outcome. They had already lost before the operation began, before the negotiation started, before the game-deciding moment arrived. They had mentally rehearsed the full weight of failure, processed it, and moved through it. And that prior processing is precisely what freed their cognition to operate at full capacity when everyone else around them was burning mental bandwidth trying to prevent something they hadn't yet accepted as possible. This is not a modern discovery dressed up in ancient clothing. It is an ancient discovery that modern cognitive science has spent decades reverse engineering without realizing it had already been documented with extraordinary precision in an 18th century Japanese text that most people have either never heard of or fundamentally misread. The Hagakure was dictated between 1710 and 1716 by a retired samurai named Yamamoto Tsunetomo. It is often described as a warrior's code, a set of rules for battle, a philosophical guide to honor and loyalty. All of those descriptions are partially accurate and collectively insufficient. What the Hagakure actually is when you read it through the lens of what we now understand about cognitive performance under pressure, is a systematic manual for eliminating the single variable that most reliably destroys human performance at the worst possible moment: the unprocessed fear of a specific outcome. Tsunetomo did not tell warriors to be brave. He told them to be dead, to have resolved, internally and completely, the question of what happens when the worst comes. Because a mind that has finished processing loss does not waste processing power trying to prevent it. It thinks, it adapts, it moves. That is the mechanism, and it is one of the most well-documented performance advantages in the scientific literature on high-stakes decision-making, operating under a different name, in a different language, in a completely different century. If this kind of investigation is what you want more of, the subscribe button keeps the next one in your feed. What the science of elite decision-making accidentally rediscovered about samurai psychology. Most people, when they hear the word samurai, think of a specific image: the armor, the blade, the unwavering composure in the face of death. And that image is not wrong exactly, but it points to the surface of something much more structurally interesting, and the surface is not where the useful information lives. Here is what the surface obscures. The composure was not the product of exceptional personality. It was the product of a specific cognitive procedure that had been systematically practiced until it became automatic. The samurai who walked into a dangerous situation with apparent calm was not born with that calm. He had manufactured it through deliberate mental rehearsal of the outcome he feared most. This procedure has a modern name. Psychologist Gary Klein formalized it in the 1990s after studying how expert decision makers in high-stakes environments, firefighters, military commanders, intensive care nurses, made better decisions than less experienced counterparts. Not because they considered more options, but because they immediately recognized which patterns were reliable and which were dangerous. Out of that research came a specific technique he called the premortem. The premortem works like this. Before any critical decision or high-stakes action, You do not imagine success. You imagine complete failure, not the abstract possibility of failure. Specific, concrete, fully realized failure. You ask, assume this has already gone wrong. Assume the worst outcome has already occurred. Now work backwards. What caused it? What did we miss? What did we assume that we shouldn't have? Organizations that systematically use premortems before major decisions consistently make fewer catastrophic errors than those that don't. Not because they become more pessimistic, because they eliminate the optimism bias, the cognitive distortion that makes humans systematically overestimate the probability of good outcomes because they haven't genuinely engaged with the bad ones. Tsunetomo called the same procedure, the way of the samurai is found in death. Klein called it the premortem. The terminology is separated by 300 years, and two entirely different intellectual traditions. The mechanism is identical. What makes this more than an interesting historical parallel is what it reveals about human cognitive architecture. The brain does not distinguish meaningfully between a threat to physical survival and a threat to identity, reputation, or ego. The same neural circuitry activates. The same resources get diverted away from rational, strategic thinking toward reactive, survival-oriented behavior. And the same solution applies in both cases. Process the threat before it arrives, so that when the moment comes, the brain is not meeting it for the first time. Samurai mental training was, at its core, a technology for pre-processing the most threatening possible outcome till the brain no longer experienced it as a live threat. That is not philosophy. That is neuroscience with a 3-century head start. Here is what I want to know from you. Has there been a moment in your life where you made your clearest decision only after you genuinely accepted that it might not work out? Leave that in the comments, because the pattern in those answers reveals something important about how high performance actually operates at the individual level. Here's a detail about the Hagakure that changes everything about how you read it. The man who wrote it, Yamamoto Tsunetomo, never fought in a single battle. He lived during the Genroku era, one of the longest periods of sustained peace in Japanese feudal history. The Great Wars were over. The role of the samurai had shifted from active combatant to something closer to a bureaucratic administrator. So, you have a warrior in a world that had, at least for a while, run out of wars. And it was in this very specific condition, this absence of external conflict, that he built the most precise mental performance system his culture had ever seen. This isn't an irony. It's the core insight. The Hagakure wasn't written to prepare men for physical battle. It was written to prepare the mind for a much more subtle challenge: how to maintain elite-level cognitive function under ambiguity, social judgment, and the psychological weight of knowing your performance is always visible, but your enemies are not. Doesn't that sound familiar? It's an almost perfect description of what high performance looks like in the modern world. Tsunetomo spent years observing warriors, not in combat, but in their daily lives. He watched how men trained for war-handled situations where the enemy was uncertainty, where the threat was political, not physical, where failure didn't mean death, but humiliation, a loss of reputation, the slow, painful erosion of everything they had built. And what he noticed was incredibly consistent. The men who performed best under these pressures were the ones who had genuinely and completely internalized the possibility of total loss long before a decision was ever needed. This wasn't a coping mechanism. It was a pre-processing protocol. They had already done the cognitive work of losing before there was ever anything on the line. There is a direct parallel to this in how modern special operations units train for decision-making under extreme stress. The physical training is just the entry ticket. It prepares them for the scenario. But the real work, the cognitive training that makes up the majority of their advanced development, is about preparing for the internal state the scenario creates. Operators are systematically exposed to simulated loss, simulated failure, and every conceivable worst-case outcome. The point isn't to desensitize them. It's to ensure that when one of those outcomes happens for real, their brain processes a familiar pattern instead of a novel threat. A novel threat triggers our primal survival circuits. A familiar pattern, on the other hand, activates strategic thinking. The entire difference in performance between two equally skilled operators under identical pressure comes down to which one of those two systems is running the show. Tsunetomo built a system for exactly this. He just used a different name for it. If you're finding this valuable, hitting the like button tells the algorithm to share it with someone else who might need to hear this. Now, let's talk about the deepest lie the success industry has been selling you about mental toughness. The way it's usually defined, mental toughness is the ability to push through discomfort, to maintain focus under pressure, to keep going when every cell in your body is screaming at you to stop. It's framed as a muscle that you build through repetition and sheer refusal to quit. That picture isn't completely wrong, but it's missing the most important half of the story. The absolute top-tier performers, the warriors, operators, surgeons, and negotiators who operate at the highest documented levels under the most intense pressure, they don't primarily talk about their edge as an ability to push through. They describe it as the absence of the internal conflict that everyone else is burning energy to manage. The fight, that psychological resistance to the possibility of failure, happened long before they even walked into the room. This is the piece the success industry consistently leaves out. Not because it's a secret, but because it doesn't sell. Acceptance is a tough sell. The story of the warrior who never gave up, who kept pushing against all odds, who refused to even consider failure, that's a compelling narrative. It's also a distortion of what actually creates elite performance. The samurai who operated at the highest level wasn't the one who refused to consider failure. He was the one who had considered it so completely, so honestly, and so far in advance that by the time he needed to act, the question was already closed. Not suppressed. Closed. It was processed and integrated into his worldview. There's a measurable neurological difference between suppression and acceptance. Suppressing a thought requires constant cognitive resources. Your brain has to actively work to keep that thought at bay, and all that processing power is then unavailable for strategic thinking, pattern recognition, and creative problem solving. But genuine acceptance of a possible outcome terminates that resource drain. It frees up your cognitive bandwidth. This is well documented in trauma research, performance psychology, and the clinical literature on anxiety. The techniques that produce the most lasting reductions in performance limiting fear aren't the ones that teach you to override the fear. They are the ones that guide you through a complete processing of the feared outcome until your brain no longer classifies it as an unresolved threat. Yamamoto Tsunetomo was running this exact protocol with samurai back in the 18th century. He didn't have neuroimaging scans or clinical trials. He had decades of keen observation and an exceptionally precise mind. And what he saw, over and over, is the same thing that every serious researcher in cognitive performance science keeps finding when they look honestly at what separates the elite from the truly exceptional. It is not the refusal to lose. It is the prior acceptance of loss, an acceptance so complete that the mind stops treating it as a threat and starts treating it as a solved problem. That single shift, from unresolved threat to solved problem, is the entire mechanism. Everything else is just detail. Thanks for watching. If this resonated with you, consider subscribing for more insights into the deep structures of performance. I'll see you in the next one. What if the most powerful mental operating system available to you has been accessible all along? The investigation has moved through history, philosophy, neuroscience, and field evidence. What it arrives at is simpler than any of those components individually. The highest performing version of a human mind is not the one that is most committed to winning. It is the one that has most completely processed the possibility of not winning, and therefore operates without the internal drag that compromises everyone else. This is applicable right now, today, in whatever high-stakes environment you are currently operating in. The practical implementation is direct. Before any decision that carries significant weight, a negotiation, a conversation, a strategic choice, a commitment that involves real risk, you stop. You do not visualize success. You go in the other direction. You construct the specific failure scenario with precision. What does it look like? What does it cost? What does it mean? What happens to the things that matter to you if this goes wrong? You stay with that construction long enough for your nervous system to process it as a real possibility, not an abstraction you are gesturing at to feel responsible. And then you act, not because the acceptance guarantees success, but because the mind that has completed that processing is operating in a fundamentally different cognitive state than the one that has not. It has access to its full strategic capacity. It is not allocating resources to threat suppression. It is free to read the environment accurately, adapt in real time, and make the kind of decisions that are only available to a mind that is not simultaneously fighting its own fear of the outcome. This is the psychology of high achievement that most frameworks never reach. The self-mastery literature tends to stop at discipline, the ability to do hard things consistently. What Tsunetomo was mapping was one level deeper, the internal architecture that makes discipline sustainable under genuine pressure. When the cost of failure is real and visible, and the outcome is not certain. The ancient mental frameworks that produced this level of performance were not culturally specific. They were not confined to feudal Japan, or to warriors, or to a context that no longer exists. They were precise observations about how human cognition works under conditions of uncertainty and high stakes. Those conditions have not changed. The tools that were engineered for them remain as functional today as they were in 1710. What you have reached here is a specific layer of the investigation. There are layers beneath it, places where the same mechanism appears in contexts you would not expect, operating at scales and in domains that change the picture significantly. The pattern does not stop at the Hagakure. It goes back further, and it reaches forward in directions that the modern performance conversation has not yet mapped. The investigation continues. If this changed how you think about mental toughness and what elite performance actually requires, the subscribe button is how you stay inside the investigation as it goes deeper. Hit the bell, the next one goes somewhere no one expects. And one specific question before you go. Based on what you've just discovered, what is the one high-stakes situation in your life, right now, where you have not yet genuinely processed the worst possible outcome? Not where you are afraid of it, where you have not yet done the work of accepting it. Write that in the comments. That answer is the beginning of the actual work.